Hello, everybody. Lovely to see you here this afternoon, and welcome to today's MECLA Spotlight event. My name is Monica Richter. I'm a project director for MECLA, the Materials and Embodied Carbon Leaders Alliance, and I also work on low carbon futures at WWF-Australia. But thank you for joining us today to explore the findings of our report, Homes and Habitats. It's a report that highlights the opportunity to align Australia's or Queensland's housing, infrastructure and built environment ambitions with nature positive outcomes. Before we start, I want to acknowledge that we are on country, to pay my respects to elders past, present. We are on country all of the time, and country-centred thinking is something that I think will help us to bridge the gaps where we are now, to do less harm, to shifting towards doing better than we have. So for those of you who don't know MECLA so well, MECLA, we're a pre-competitive alliance that brings together leaders from across the built environment value chain, industry, government, researchers, investors and civil society to accelerate the transition to a low carbon, circular and resilient built environment. We operate within a clear governance framework that encourages collaboration while maintaining boundaries around competition and commercial activity. And importantly, we take a systems level view. We call ourselves a do tank. So we're very much about not just identifying the challenges and opportunities, but how do we work collaboratively in that pre-competitive space to design, test and scale practical solutions that can shift markets and influence policy. So our real focus is around embodied carbon and transforming material supply chains. And I guess what makes the Homes and Habitats report useful is that it broadens out this conversation. And we know that, the materials that go into the built environment are the considerable part of the impacts on nature, according to the World Economic Forum. About 95% of built environment supply chains are contributing to nature habitat loss. So, the choices that we make, the decisions that we make and how we build, where we build, all of these have impacts on how well nature survives and what we can do to make it thrive. So we have a range of very serious challenges, and this report is really trying to suggests that through smarter planning, better design, stronger policy settings, we can do better than we have been up to now. So today's discussion, it really is all about how we break down those silos and address these particular issues. So I'm delighted that we have the authors presenting the findings of the report today. We've got Michelle Ward, Sophie St John, Abigail Heywood, and then once we've had the presentation of the report, we will go into a panel discussion with Adam Muir and Mara Bun. So from that point of view, please, if you have Q&A, please put them in the Q&A function. I'll remind you a few times. So I am going to pass it over to Michelle. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Monica. Hi, everyone. My name is Michelle Ward. I am a lecturer at Griffith University, and I led the research and science behind the report. Next slide, please, Amy. Thank you. So as we probably know, biodiversity is absolutely critical for people, for community, for everything really, from our pollinators that ensure we have secure food, to our coral reefs that protect people and property, to the plants that give us medicine. We know that about 50% of Australia's GDP is absolutely dependent on nature. And for every dollar invested in adaptation, we can save between $2 and $11 in disaster recovery. So absolutely critical from everything from culture to health benefits to water, and of course, species conservation benefits. Next slide, please. Thank you. Despite its absolute critical importance, humans are destroying biodiversity. So Earth has experienced 5 mass species extinction events so far, the last one being the extinction of the dinosaurs from an asteroid. And we are now currently experiencing a 6th mass extinction driven by one species, humans. In Australia, we are not immune to this problem. In fact, biodiversity loss in Australia is one of the worst in the world. We are the leaders in mammal extinctions compared to any other nation. We're also experiencing a dramatic increase in our temperatures driven by human-driven climate change. And as we can see from the figure down there, this is resulting in more severe fires, more severe droughts, more severe flooding, and other extreme weather events. Biodiversity loss and climate change are deeply intertwined problems, and both are driven largely by the removal of native vegetation, which destroys habitat for our species, but also from the climate change perspective, releases stored carbon, resulting in a worsening crisis for both. Next slide, please. So we often hear this rhetoric around, we love nature, but we also need critical infrastructure and houses and roads. And these are often framed as sort of competing priorities, but we believe this is a false dichotomy. So if you have poorly planned urban expansion that removes critical nature, we're exposing our communities to climate risks, making like floods, like you can see in that picture, and fire, which makes our houses uninsurable. Without nature, we have a decrease in mental health, decrease in air quality, our water quality also decreases. We're increasing the cost of living, which is at the moment incredibly high, through the need for artificial heating and cooling. Whereas on the other side, if you have well-located, higher density, nature-positive development and planning, this can reduce total systems costs by reducing infrastructure and associated maintenance costs. It can reduce affordability pressures through reduced transportation and insurance costs, like I mentioned before, and also deliver more livable communities, cooler communities that we can walk around and enjoy active transportation and recreation and have that social and cultural connection. Next slide, please. So through recognizing the importance of nature, we're seeing a real change. At the global level, we have this nature positive promise, which sort of sets out a global goal to halt and reverse nature loss by 2030 with a full recovery by 2050. So lots of companies are signing on to this promise and pledge and are actively trying to reverse their historical declines and ensure that nature is increasing. On the industry level and government level here in Australia, we can see GBCA have now released a nature positive roadmap outlining really clearly what we need to be doing to be able to be nature positive. ISC has embedded ecology and nature related outcomes in their IS rating system. ASBEC is providing cross-sector policy leadership on embodied carbon. MECLA is another great one, another great example, who are engaging the supply chain, which, as Monica mentioned, is a critical part of reducing our impacts on nature. And in Queensland, the state government are now rolling out world-class bioregional plans that protect biodiversity, in particular, irreplaceable habitat features. So those old growth trees that we cannot replace within a relevant time frame, the things that we just cannot offset. So that's been really great to see. Next slide, please, Amy. And so what did we do in this report? Next slide. So in recognizing this momentum, we set out to do 5 things. The first is to quantify the condition of ecosystems across Queensland, quantify nature vegetation loss attributed to different land use pressures in Queensland's ecosystems, identify the industries that are most responsible for that impact, understand where we must stop clearing and protect and restore places, and identify the opportunities for change. So it's a little bit heavy, but I'll run you through the methods of the scientific method that we chose to apply. So to quantify native vegetation loss, we intersected the 2017 land use data set with a pre-clearing regional ecosystem map to assess impacts on ecosystems. So an example of that land use data set is what you can see on the right with all of the different colors. So every piece of land has been identified as a particular land use. So that could be, for example, cropping or perennial horticulture. It could be a mine, it could be a house, a road. So every bit of Queensland has been classified in this land use system. We then extracted 34 of the relevant land uses, broadly categorised into the built environment, infrastructure, and resources. So I've ticked a few of those on the legend down the bottom of the map there. So you can see things like residential housing, services, utilities. Those were all categorised as the built environment, infrastructure, or resources. We then analysed the potential for further clearing per ecosystem by classifying all land use categories into 5 conditions and potential management categories. So they included already protected from clearing. So those are areas that are already under a protected area within the protected area estate. Could be protected. So those are really nice pieces of nature that aren't protected but are still intact. Degraded with the potential for passive restoration. So this may include just like removing cattle or removing the invasive species. The nature is still there. You just need to remove a few of the pressures and then everything would come back to a natural kind of state and then protect it. Degraded with the potential for active restoration. So these are pretty degraded areas that really need active planting or reseeding to ensure that they come back. Or cleared and unlikely to be restored. So these are areas that have like a road or a house, like infrastructure that we're unlikely to remove and restore nature to. We then assessed how much every ecosystem required restoration or protection to meet a 30% protection target. So that 30% protection target comes from a range of literature which basically says between 30 and 50% of an ecosystem needs to be retained in order to ensure that we have the function of a healthy environment where species can still live and survive and breed and do all the things that they need to do. And then also that 30% protection target aligns with a national and global target that we have set as a country and as a globe to have 30% protection of every ecosystem. We then zoomed in to Southeast Queensland as a hotspot for future development. And we mapped 2 exemptions, so 2 ways in which people can clear land with really minimal environmental assessment. And that's the urban area for urban purpose and a priority development area to see how much more clearing is likely within Southeast Queensland. And then finally, we assessed how much of those exemptions are on top of currently irreplaceable habitat features. So those are areas that cannot be offset. We cannot recover them. They are non-offsetable. Next slide, please. And then finally, we brought together cross-sector participants from industry, government, non-for-profits, consultants, and academia to really think through and review the findings and identify and prioritize actions that we really need to see more transformative change. So I'm now going to hand over to Abby to tell us what we found. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Michelle. And thank you for the opportunity to be here as well. So could we go to the next slide, please? And one more? Yes, great. So as Michelle's just explained the methodology that we went through. So I'm just going to go through some of the findings from the research and step them through in the next few slides. So our first finding was that the built environment and infrastructure land uses are responsible for extensive clearing, and that totaled 1.25 million hectares of native ecosystems, and that affected 78% of Queensland's terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems, which is about 1,095 ecosystems in total that were impacted. And this clearing was heavily concentrated in the southeast Queensland area, which you can see from the inset on the map there, which shows, for example, the yellow being a high concentration of the residential urban pressures in that sort of the Gold Coast, inland to Toowoomba and up to Gympie. Next slide, please. So continuing to look a bit closer. So when we actually compare the land uses, so we've divided them into 3 categories. You can see here, as Michelle said, with that built environment, infrastructure, and resources, with the resources being that proxy for supply chain. So when we compare these land use, the built environment cleared significantly more area than any of the other two categories, with 716,000 hectares of clearing, which you can see on the graph on the left. And that's more than double the amount that the infrastructure land use cleared. You can see the bars next to each other there. And also, when you actually look at the number of ecosystems that were impacted, infrastructure actually cleared a wider range of ecosystems compared with the other two categories, although obviously they're all still high in and of themselves. Could you, next slide, please? And then diving a little bit deeper again to this last layer, when you actually break it further down and look at the urban pressures individually that come within those categories for each land use, you can see that the highest vegetation clearing was from rural residential without agriculture, with 393,000 hectares being cleared. And to put that in perspective, that's more than the total infrastructure amount of clearing that we saw on the previous slide. So it dwarfs any other category. And this is followed closely then by another residential category of urban residential with a further 161,000 hectares. So those two pressures contributing a huge amount to the overall clearing. And then reservoir and dam, so that infrastructure category then coming in with 132,000 hectares of clearing. Next slide, please. So the built environment infrastructure land uses are directly responsible for the significant decline of ecosystems, and this does include threatened ecosystems. And the research show that it contributed to the serious decline of 106 ecosystem types themselves. And just to talk you through this table, you can see that the majority of the 106 ecosystems actually had a conservation status of endangered or of concern. And to put that in context, by definition, an endangered ecosystem is when the remnant vegetation is less than 10% of its pre-clearing extent, and of concern is when it's less than 10 to 30% of its pre-clearing extent. So going back to what Michelle was saying about 30% being that threshold, that means that if a habitat goes below that extent, it affects its integrity and its ability to function. So simply, if a habitat is, an ecosystem is endangered or of concern, then it seriously risks its ability to that ecological function. So what this means here is the majority of these ecosystems are already being impacted below that threshold of 30%. So it's a little bit nuanced in the sense that you can see at the top of the table, we've got two ecosystems there that we've completely lost, and we've completely lost those to these urban and infrastructure pressures. And then you can see there the 9 underneath. So they again have been cleared more than 50% of their original extent. So they're being seriously threatened here. But then if you look at the bottom half of the table, there's 95 ecosystems there that have had between 10 and 50% of their extent cleared by the infrastructure and built environment pressures. So what that means is, because they're endangered or concerned, these ecosystems are actually also getting impacted by other pressures that we didn't consider in our research. So you have a bucket of ecosystems that are directly impacted by built environment and infrastructure, and then you have these other bucket of ecosystems where it's death by 1,000 cuts. They're getting impacted by other pressures that weren't considered in the research. Next slide, please. So many of these ecosystems being cleared are unlikely to be restored. And just to talk you through this, as Michelle said, the GBF commits us to a number of targets, but one of them is this 30% of degraded ecosystems to be under effective restoration by 2030. So if we step through what this means in the context of our research, so when you look at the ecosystems, the research showed that of those 1,095 that were affected, so 15%, so the yellow bar that you can see there, are already inside protected areas. So that means that 85% of the ecosystems that have less of their 30% left are not formally protected, and those actually represent the other bars in this graph. So just walking through, 25% of ecosystems, so that's the dark blue color, could meet this 30% threshold with no restoration, and only formal protection would be required. So this would be the low-hanging fruit, almost the cheapest and easiest option to do to start protecting the habitats, the ecosystems. 64% of them do require either active restoration, which is that light blue bar, or the passive restoration, which is the dark blue bar. So this recognizes also as well that the active restoration, or the research recognize that active restoration is actually the most expensive restoration, because passive restoration is more like it removes the pressure. So that could be overgrazing or something like that. Whereas active restoration is more planting and more sort of intensive activities. And then there are 3 ecosystems that are unlikely to reach that 30% intact, which is obviously very hard to read. But what is good about this data is that it shows us that we can still act and we can restore ecosystems to that 30% threshold through those measures. And also, if we're targeted about it, when you look at how the large proportion that comes in that dark green bar, it shows that we can actually do this in a cost-effective way as well. Because, yeah, sorry, next slide, please. And looking here at the distribution of those, you can see that the 2 of the 3 ecosystems that will never reach that 30%, they were the red bar previously, are actually here in Queensland, 2 of them. And so they are actually a grassland ecosystem, so 12.8.27, and a open forest ecosystem as well. So both of those have lost too much to be restored. Next slide, please. So almost 40% of places where urban exemptions apply in southeast Queensland contain irreplaceable habitat. So when we did this case study and delved deeper, we found that there was 20,273 hectares that may be at risk of development under these urban purpose or priority development area exemptions. And so when we break this down further, you can see that 38% is actually mapped as irreplaceable habitat feature, which Michelle talked to before. So these can't be replaced or recreated in an ecologically relevant time frame. And there are 62 ecosystems that could be affected if these exemptions are enacted. And there's one ecosystem that would be unlikely to achieve that 30% restored and protected as well. And next slide. So we also found some limitations with the data. And so if these could be addressed, we feel we'd get more insights. So the data set that was used was actually dated to 2017, and that's because the Queensland vegetation land use data sets are only updated every 10 years. And so this meant that I guess our fear is that there's been significantly more clearing since then, but it wasn't actually in our data. So the situation could be worse in terms of loss of extent and conservation status of some of those ecosystems. And the data that we had, we weren't able to forecast what is coming in terms of what could be cleared, because there isn't a consolidated spatial layer that defines what the urban footprint is. So that made it really difficult to look at data moving forward. And also with the offsets, we found that the Commonwealth and state offset registers are not linked. So it was really hard to keep track of this vegetation loss, what had and hadn't been offset through that process. But we felt that those limitations didn't materially alter the findings of this study, although they do highlight gaps for future work. Thank you. Hand over to Sophie.
Thanks. So Michelle has outlined what we did. Abby has outlined what we found. And now it's my pleasure to outline what we can do. And in looking at the attendance list for this event, we have all the right people in the room to do this. So I'm really excited to be able to share this with you. Next slide, please. There are 4 key actions we can progress together. So as my other speakers have outlined, when we came up with these, this was a deeply collaborative effort The research we presented presents a case study for Queensland, but we expect these results would be replicated across the country. And so in that spirit, we thought about things that we could do together and as in our various sectors that are applicable across the country. And so the first one is collaborate. Developers, planners, other peak bodies, so ISC, GBCA, ASBEC, MECLA, who were involved in this report, but also those who weren't, the Master Builders Association, the Housing Industry Association, the Planning Institute, UDIA. We all need to come together, as well as developers, as well as government, to make sure we've got that whole value chain pushing in the right direction and collaborating to drive better outcomes through that aligned leadership. The second one is educate. We can all work to educate within our sphere of influence, and all those on the call today are obviously already doing their part. We often find that people don't understand what we mean when we talk about nature, or about nature's benefits, or about the various tools and frameworks that already exist to be able to understand nature and how you are interfacing with nature. The next one was enable, and I'll talk a bit more about this in a second, but there's a plethora of tools that are out there, and there's also additional tools that we identified we need. For example, to do our cost benefit analysis or determine the return on investment for nature. Those of you who may have heard of me talk about this before, I often talk about how nature gets value engineered out of our designs. And the reason for that, in my opinion, is that we don't adequately value nature and all of the ecosystem services that nature provides. And if we did, if we were building those into how we calculated return on investment and cost benefit analysis, I guarantee we'd have better outcomes. So that piece is about how do we enable the whole of our sector to have the tools that they need to make informed choices and decisions. And then finally, the thing we can do together is steward. I acknowledge a gap in this paper is that it was not produced in deep consultation with traditional owners. And so we acknowledge that all land is Aboriginal land, and as such, a cross-cutting recommendation of this paper is that this partnership with traditional owners and investment spend in Aboriginal-owned organisations, and we say that cuts across all actions and recommendations. Next slide, please. To double down on that enablement piece, I just wanted to draw your attention to a bit that already exists. So this is a collaboration outside of the Homes and Habitat report, but I know some people on the call today and also some of the authors and collaborators of this paper have been involved, is our nature design guideline. And this is not just a guide, it's an invitation to lead. You can, if you type in nature design guide, you can download that one from the MECLA website. And similar to our Homes and Habitat paper, it's a practical industry-led resource that embeds those nature positive and country-centered approaches. So already delivering on that stewardship and embedding piece, and it calls for stronger nature outcomes for anyone involved in shaping the built environment. Next slide, please. Then we had 4 key pillars of action, which will be slightly different depending on where you sit in the value chain. Now, I'm not going to talk through all of those because that is quite a big section in the report. I encourage you to download it for yourself. But the players we categorized as industry, so generally the private sector, government, that being Commonwealth, state and local government, and then also advocacy. And together, these are 4 things each need to do. But depending on where you sit in the value chain, that will be something, you'll do something slightly different. So the first one is the mitigation hierarchy. In our legislation, that's defined as avoid, minimize, mitigate, and then offset. And the science-based targets for nature defines that as avoid, reduce, restore, regenerate, and then transform the systems so that we no longer have to degrade nature. This might be a bit trite. I'm sure you've heard this many, many times, but as our findings from our report illustrate, this simply isn't happening. In fact, as Abby pointed out, these irreplaceable features, being features that by their very definition, once they're gone forever, are still being cleared. So we know that this isn't being applied. And when we say apply it, one of the fundamental underpinnings of this report is that we acknowledge we're in an affordable housing crisis and an extinction crisis. So all these recommendations, we thought about what we must do together to advance both. And one of them is being really deliberate about where we're citing infrastructure and housing development. So we're avoiding at least those irreplaceable features, which by their very definition, once they're gone forever. The second one is density done well. I understand this is one of the pillars of the Green Building Council's Nature Roadmap. So if you want to learn more about that, then go to that, download that paper as well. And as Michelle has said, the reason we recommend that is for a whole lot of reasons. We believe that density done well will help us both reduce the cost of living, but also protect nature. We know when we sprawl out, we need more roads, we need more water pipelines, you name it. And then we're increasing transport costs, potentially putting people at risk, because most people have to travel to that density centre for health, education, or employment, for example. Number 3 is nature positive design. And I've already spoken to those nature design guidelines, but that's about how we mainstream nature in the built environment and infrastructure sector and how we design. I often work with councils in the intersection of climate and nature and how they come together. I recently interviewed a council in Victoria, and they said to me, nature is more expensive, nature-based design is more expensive to maintain. And when I drilled into that, they were sending out, they had these hybrid solutions, and they were sending out an asset management maintenance team and a landscape team. So it's not necessarily some of these things that, some of these mistruths, I suppose, get spread because we're not sure how to use nature in design and how to maintain nature in design. So that's where those nature design guidelines come in. And then the fourth pillar is commitments and transparency. So what can you, wherever you sit, whether it's in advocacy, in government, or in an organisation, what commitments can you make to nature within your sphere of influence on a site, on a precinct, or what can we do together potentially at a catchment scale? And then obviously the monitoring of that and advocacy's role in making sure that we're achieving what we set out to achieve. Next slide, please. And the next one. So what should we do next? I've talked to the actions I spoke about are things that we can and should be doing now. Abby's spoken to some of these already about the future directions. There were some things that were outside the scope of this paper, but that we thought were worth touching on. Number 1 is collaboration with the finance sector. We know we need to direct capital into these nature restoration projects. That includes things like thinking about our taxonomies to enable that, leveraging our nature markets. There's a whole lot that needs to happen in how we invest, lend, and finance nature, and that's a separate thing for the future. Advocating and leveraging high integrity environmental markets. We're one of the only nations in the world with a legislated nature repair market, but so far we've only got 1 approved method and 2 registered projects. So how can we use that existing infrastructure to really drive that for nature repair? And then understanding and responding to embodied nature impacts in materials. There is research that suggests that the nature impacts in our supply chain are 95% of the environmental impacts. So if you consider our report as the 5%, the on-site impacts, there's a whole lot. We're just looking really at the tip of the iceberg. Then on the research side, repeat this research with more recent data, as Abby has mentioned. Identify which of those impacts are or are not being offset. We know our offset framework isn't working because if it was, we would have seen different results to what we saw. We haven't seen no net loss. We haven't seen a net gain across any of those categories of ecosystems. We've seen a broad scale decline across all. We need to spatially register that urban footprint so we can project and forecast future risk. That's really important. If we're setting exemptions or policy, it's really helpful to be able to understand how that policy may play out within the vegetation and communities we have remaining, and expanding our understanding of the impacts on irreplaceable features. There is a hook in our new EPBC Act, reformed EPBC Act, for irreplaceable habitats. So some really tight definition about what that looks like is really important. And just one more slide from me. I've given you a whole lot of stuff that you can do and we can do together now and in the future. but I didn't want to overwhelm you. I just wanted to leave you with one thing. And the authors we met, we were talking about if we could wave our magic wand and just do one thing, advocate for one thing and get our audience to do just one thing, what would it be? And it would be to stop clearing those irreplaceable features. So again, those irreplaceable features by their very nature, once they're gone forever. That means within an ecologically relevant time frame, you heard Abby say, they can't be replaced. So these are things like old growth forests, large hollow bearing trees. We know it takes a tree about 100 years to form a hollow. Artesian springs, things like that, which we just really cannot replicate. And if we stop clearing irreplaceable features, then everything else theoretically is offsettable, which means we can provide an offset. And that's obviously assuming that we have robust offset frameworks that deliver no net loss as a minimum and net gain. But if we stop clearing those things, then by virtue, we can repair what is left. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sophie. Thank you very much, Michelle. And now we're going to turn to our panelists. So I'd like to introduce Adam Muir, who's our Nature Positive Policy Manager at WWF, and also Tamara Bun. And then we'll invite Abby to come back as well. So Adam, I want to go to you first, given the work that you've been doing, rolling up your sleeves over the last 12 months or so for the EPBC reforms. And I guess, keen to hear the outputs that have come out of and the findings that have come out of this report, affected 78% of Queensland's ecosystems. And it would be really good to hear your reflections on the findings and kind of the evidence of how you think those EPBC reforms will intersect with the findings of the report. How does bioregional planning also intersect? And when you and I have these conversations, we talk a lot about what the cumulative impacts mean for that death by 1,000 cuts. So it's that decision making. So it'd be great to kind of get your reflections on what has been happening at the federal level with those laws and how they intersect. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Monica. Thanks, everyone. Sorry, I was having trouble with my new video camera there. So I'm dialing in from Wurundjeri country. So I just pay my respects to Wurundjeri elders, past and present. Great opportunity, fantastic report. Look, the EPBC Act, it's clearly not been working. I think the government has said that. All the data has pointed to that. The Samuel review in 2020 certainly made that really clear. And Michelle's already touched on this. Biodiversity is continuing to decline despite all the great stuff that's going on. And, we expect, I think Australians expect the Premier environmental legislation to at least provide a bit of a safety net so we're not actively making things worse through our kind of economic activities. It's not going to solve everything, but it's a really important place to start. So I think the Queensland example and what this report highlights is just another failure to properly regulate a lot of the impacts that have clearly been going on. Some of that is highly relevant to the EPBC Act, and some of it will be relevant more to the state framework, of course. The fact that what was the figure? 20,500 hectares of native vegetation is at risk of development and probably not even covered by the Queensland framework. So it's not even offset. It's a great example. I think, look, part of the point of the EPBC reform was for the Commonwealth to reclaim, well, this is how we kind of see it, reclaim accountability over matters of national environmental significance. So the things that are clearly national level, they're listed, and making sure those things aren't forgotten about and they're dealt with properly. Setting standards, we've heard about national environmental standards, providing guardrails around unacceptable impacts, and removing some of the blanket exemptions that existed, including for, the regional forest agreements, and for some of the agricultural clearing. So really getting things on a more consistent playing field and saying, hey, M&ES, matters of national environmental significance, that's threatened species, threatened ecological communities, Ramsar wetlands, Great Barrier Reef, etc., etc. All these things are Commonwealth responsibilities, and the Commonwealth Act needs to deal with these properly. But the other really key point of this is the flow-on effect to the states and how the Commonwealth and the states need to work together. Some of this stuff will be, that we're talking about, will be absolutely relevant to the EPBC Act. Some of it will be always dealt with at state level, but part of the flow-on effect that we're, the intent of these EPBC reforms is to work together with the states to have a more consistent approach to some of these issues, to apply the standards at state level, to identify where the gaps are in the state frameworks and improve them. And in terms of urban developments, as I said, the EPBC regulates urban developments as well. If there's, a significant impact on a matter of national environmental significance, there's no exemptions for that. There's new rules and new tools that will both be really relevant to that, I think, in terms of what's rolling out. Some of them have been flagged already. So the MECLA standard, so the National Environmental Standard for Matters of National Environmental Significance, which is hand in hand with a new offset standard, that's going to, it's not finished and we haven't seen the final wording of it, but it's probably going to affect how urban developments are planned and, what can and can't happen where. If nothing else, because the mitigation hierarchy will be firmly embedded in that, as it is already in the legislation. It'll be explained what that means. And alongside the standard will be the unacceptable impacts test, and Michelle and Abby both highlighted, and Sophie, the idea of irreplaceability. So this is now in the legislation, this idea about irreplaceable habitat and how it needs to be considered as part of the unacceptable impacts test. Of course, there's a lot of work that needs to still happen to get that properly defined and meaningful on the ground for particular species, but that work's going on, and it's really important we get that right. There's also going to be a new net gain test that the minister's been flagging as really important. Again, that's not defined yet, so there's still work going on over the next few months around that. But all these things are going to materially affect, in some cases, how and the form of urban development and where and so on. And then in terms of the tools, I think the key one here is probably the bioregional plans, which you mentioned, Monica. They've got a new lease of life in the reforms, and they're now two-tiered. So there's a guidance plan that can be developed, which provides, state-of-the-art information over a large area about where all these matters of national environmental significance are, and gives a sense of an analysis essentially around, what should be avoided and what is at less risk. And then beyond that, there's a bioregional plan that's called a regulatory plan, and that's the one that actually sets out go zones and no-go zones for particular types of development. So it determines, certain developments can go over here, that's okay, and then they provide a fast track to that development actually proceeding, as long as that development never occurs in the no-go zones, also known as conservation zones, clearly. So I think both of those are really, really useful. I mean, my fervent hope is that they will be done. We haven't really seen a good model of these in terms of urban development yet. There's been some other pilots of the information plans in Queensland, but we haven't seen the Southeast Queensland one which will be very interesting and a great example. But I think if nothing else, getting the information clear, having the information there allows you to assess cumulative impacts, because that's really the whole point of it, right? So it's not a project by project appraisal. It actually gives you an ability to look across the whole area. And I think that, hand in hand with the standard for matters of national environmental significance, which already identifies cumulative impacts as an important issue. Again, we haven't seen the final wording, but we're hoping that will reinforce that concept. So then when you do have the information, say in a bioregional plan, you can actually do some of this work to properly address cumulative impacts. So I really hope the bioregional plans will be at a scale and suitable for the planning cycle that they actually promote avoidance of important habitat, because that is the key point. That's something the report has so highlighted. This idea about the compact urban footprint rather than continuing to sprawl. So I'm hoping the bioregional plans will assist that. I might leave it there.
Yeah, thank you, Adam. I mean, it's really great to get your reflections on what's happening at that federal level, work that still needs to be done. But it sounds like there's a lot of good work being done to try and define it, to make it clearer. Because, developers want to know what their boundaries are. We want, that to be reflected in state government planning processes. We want to understand, how do we go about protecting and what those, definitional processes are. And it sounds like there's really good work happening between the federal government and the state governments as well. So Mara, turning to you, and it's great to have you on board here. You live, work in Southeast Queensland, and you've worked in kind of various different spaces of bringing the investor groups in, bringing kind of the climate risk and resilience in. So you bring a whole range of different thinking in schools. So I'd be really great to reflect on what you've heard about the report itself, and where you think we can kind of take this conversation forward to be thinking about how we protect and preserve nature, but also the role that nature plays as kind of building resilient infrastructure for us into a changing kind of climate future. Thanks.
Wow. So a free kick, any direction. So it really is like a huge pleasure to be here with MECLA, and I'm mindful of, the people in the audience, right, which include several from City of Gold Coast, other regional councils around the country, the materials value chain, the finance, I think NAB and others are here. So this is so exciting. What I love about this report in the context of, I guess, the built environment in Queensland is, if we step back and think about the principles of nature itself and where its greatest biodiversity emerges, right? It's this principle called edge abundance, like when two ecosystems meet, then a maximum of diversity kind of explodes. And it might be when an ocean hits through a wetland into an estuary and a riverine ecosystem. And then the same thing happens as the forests come into the grasslands. And the interesting thing about the built environment is, in Australia, on the East Coast, and in Queensland in particular, it happens on a very, very narrow strip where the maximum edge abundance exists. And part of that is because our catchments here are closer to the coast than they are in other, like the southern part of Eastern Australia. And I made the joyful move 20 years ago from Sydney to a place behind Burleigh Beach called Talabudra Valley that many of you apparently came to as kids to play in the creek, and hopefully now bring your kids as well. And so I live on acreage very much within the report when they talk about that rural, residential, previously agricultural area, which is the huge chunk of loss of, sort of biodiversity. That's where I live. And why am I so hopeful? Like this very weekend, all of our little community is gathering in someone's shed because it's someone's birthday. But if you look at this image, this is my road 60 years ago. And it was banana country as well as dairy country. And if you looked at this now, you would see what you would see sort of out my window, if you could see it a little bit more. I mean, it is just lush, regenerate. Why? Because we are on the perimeter of Gondwana rainforest. And it is precious no-go zone, ecosystem habitat. And so much of Southeast Queensland has that tension, whether it's the ocean ecosystems, the wetlands, the marine parks, or in the hinterland as it presses down. And so I think this report is hugely hopeful. We also have now much better public transport within our cities and down across our coasts, and we should be going absolutely dense and up in those areas. And I do feel like there's a very interesting timing moment here, notwithstanding our politics, which are a bit insane unless you spend time in America like I do, in which case they feel kind of mundane, right? But set aside the polar politics that we have, this report, I think, is very important. Last month, another very important report was launched, and I was also involved in launching it with the Responsible Industry Investment Association, RIA. And that was a report commissioned by the Australian Ethical Foundation through the Biodiversity Council. Encourage people to look it up because it's called Cracking the Code, Using Nature Data to Understand the Impact of the ASS 200 on Nature. And so we looked across sectors, across value chains, and then drilled down on a number of corporates to understand using S&P data, MSCI data, and a wonderful platform called Gist Impact, which I encourage people to just look into because they translate scrape data from every listed corporate in Australia, including many on this call, so that we can understand water, energy, materials, every toxic waste, every kind of impact, wrap it up into what's called a PDF factor, which is a biodiversity term that measures the equivalence of that kind of impact on biodiversity harm. It's an abstract measure. Obviously, it's not locational, spatial, but it's useful. And then Just Impact turns that into actual square kilometers of restoration responsibility. Like, it's insanely interesting. But one of the key insights was, although, for example, Coles and NAB, appreciating that NAB is on this call, directly, in terms of their own impact, very narrow, from a value change point of view, vast leverage. In that same way, financial institutions, property developers, material suppliers are going to have a huge, disproportionate impact on that very thin, edge abundant bioregional impact that we're talking about here. And when we work with communities like mine that are all planting, actively revegetating, as well as protecting and allowing it to come back, nature will surprise us, I think. So as long as we plan well, and Monica, there's many directions to take this in. This house here is an interesting use case. Because my little corner was impacted not only by the aftermath of Cyclone Alfred, but by a big hailstorm. And so through a process of restoring a claim through Insurance Australia Group, who have been, NRMA have been my insurer forever, I've invested with them into that claim to build the resilience of the house and gradually reduce its risk, hopefully with a lower premium as well. So that's meant I have incorporated a roof using ColorBond that matches the standards of North Queensland, because I know the cyclones are coming and the regulations are not keeping up because it's too expensive. But the way I look at it, right, the average resident in Southeast Queensland pays more for insurance than for energy. And if we've been prepared to invest in solar and batteries, as we have in record numbers, to reduce the cost of our energy and become resilient, I believe we will also invest in improving the resilience of our homes so that when the cyclone does hit, it doesn't come off. The last comment I'll make, and really for colleagues and friends in local government that are marrying up this bioregional planning underneath the EPBC reforms and, kind of understanding how the standards link in at different levels of government. So for many of you that, may not be aware of the Gold Coast, it is one of the world's most successful examples of what's called betterment. We had massive cyclones here when it was a sleeping fishing and tourism village in the 1960s and 70s. And we went to Delft. We got serious infrastructure advice. We built a big A-line rock wall, which is where surfers and, we're extending that, but we built that. We stabilized the entrance to the Broadwater with the seaway. We created Wavebreak Island. All of that enabled the city to grow from 50,000 to 750,000, now going to 1 million. We need a whole new generation of that infrastructure. It's going to cost $40 billion, and we actually know what to do. There's been a long discussion about this for 20 years. We just need to mobilize the financial instruments that allow the envelope of these cities and places to be resilient, and then we can develop in the right places, using the right materials, decarbonizing as we go, and bring back the preciousness of this Gondwana heritage, which really will be worth much, much more than the buildings, already is. But when we start valuing it and encourage people to go to the Capitals Coalition to understand how the valuation is beginning to happen, it's very exciting to imagine what the future could be.
So in some ways, it's, birthing these new paradigms, isn't it, of how we build, nature as infrastructure, how we provide, financial institutions with the ability to invest, who underwrites the risk for the capital to be attracted to, build, plan well, build more density, nature-based design. But
Absolutely, Monica. And the ingredients are here. It's just been joyful to see and participate with them coming out of the ground. As Sophie said, the taxonomy is important. I was on the original expert group for the Australian Sustainable Finance Institute taxonomy. It does not yet include nature, but it will. And within the kind of guidance that you'll find within that report that the Biodiversity Council recently released, and so many others, the TNFD and various methods of measurement and so forth, there are now tools that the finance sector is actively investing in as disclosure on nature comes out of the ground. What are our dependencies? What are the impacts? And those tools will allow banks, superannuation funds, insurance companies to offer better terms for people that are doing the right thing. But here's the critical thing, right? Like, I recently went to China with the Smart Energy Council, and it absolutely transformed how I understand planning. I should have guessed, right? What is a 5-year plan? Guess what? It's part of a 30-year plan, which is part of a 60-year plan. And so I just hope that Adam is right, that these plans that we're now relying on to underpin the EPBC are not going to be those funny kinds of plans, right? Where lobbyists can kind of come in and get exceptions and whatnot. We need to draw a line like the Chinese have. They have a red line, 19% of China. I'm going back in December with Guy Williams, and we're going to start a series of nature missions to China, because guess what? They didn't stop at clean tech. They were planning for Kunming, but of course, COVID came. We have this nature repair market that has 2 methods in one project, or 1 project and 2 methods. The Chinese currently have 240 pilots with 38 methods. They have a compliance market on corporates. Alibaba, Tencent, BYD, they are off-takers in nature, not just carbon. So there's a lot for us to learn on planning.
Absolutely right. So I guess, and I wanted to bring Abby, I can't see you back here, our panelist. There you are. So sort of coming to you in some of your experience, really, how do you think developers in the private sector should engage with some of the findings in this report and some of the things that you've heard here? How do we make better market signals? How do we use the data better? I mean, what would be a good message to be able to give to developers who are on this call today?
Wow, well, it's really tough to follow Adam and Mara when all the amazing, they pretty much said it's hard to add anything to what they've already said. But oh my goodness, in terms of what I guess the developer in that sense, that was said, Sophie said before, and we said it, we really need to get serious about stopping nature loss. And so I think we really need to proactively do it rather than just being expected to be regulated in order to do it. And I think the only adding to what's been said before is I think being able to really communicate and demonstrate that value that nature brings in the built environment sense. So very much like we talked about with the nature in bringing it into nature positive design. So I think to make a difference, developers need to genuinely include it, I guess, early up in their planning so that we can make meaningful protection of areas when we're developing. And I think the work that GBCA are doing with their new updates of their tools in response to their nature roadmap is really leading. And I think that's what developers can, if they don't know what to do, that's a really good place to start. Adam mentioned the biodiversity net gain. That's been, as I understand it, really successful in the UK. So that's something that's really practical in that sense. So they're meaningful things that I guess developers can keep an eye on and start bringing into their practices. But I'd really like to touch on actually getting real and bringing into design the threads that have already been talked around climate resilience, flood defense, stormwater management, air quality, all these other ecosystem services that bringing nature and nature-based solutions into the built environment actually creates. And I don't think we've done a very good job of articulating the value that really brings financially, and that if you have nature-based solutions that actually will save you money in your design around your stormwater sizing and all sorts of things like that, and they're cheaper. Some of these design elements are cheaper and give other benefits like well-being benefits. They help reduce heat island effect. And so I think to make this a bit more business as usual and take it to the next level, I think we need to actually quantify the benefits of these things when we do them and mainstream them more. Green Star has had a really good example of when they include these practices into their tools. So the part of the market that want to do better in the sustainability space, over time that becomes business as usual. So I think that's a really good blueprint as to how you can kind of do those elements. It's quite complex. I think it's hard to say one thing, isn't it? And at DNFD, that would be the other one, really taking that seriously and really understanding our impacts.
Great. So we're going to open it up for questions. Please put them into the Q&A. I see that we've got some questions in there, but I guess before we do that, kind of a final round with the panelists. So we're having this discussion in 5 years' time. That takes us to 2031, just before the start of the Olympics. What do you hope might have changed in the way governments, industry, community have engaged on these issues to do with sort of nature positive planning and design? Adam, I'm going to start with you.
Sure. Thanks, Monica. So, look, I think the lost opportunity for the EPBC reforms was to think bigger picture. There was an opportunity to actually embed the nature positive goal, for example, in the legislation, to recognise Australia's strategy for nature in a statutory form and so on. And I think that sort of stuff would really have driven more of those nature positive behaviours and outcomes across governments and across society. The focus has really been on development approvals, but Nonetheless, I think it does still, it's set up a lot of the tools and the data and the processes that will still be incredibly useful. So even though the legislation itself may not be driving all of that, a lot of the stuff we need to do that is there. And ultimately, I think this comes back, therefore, to us. I mean, and when I say the tools and so on are there, we've mentioned the nature repair market. There's a new restoration contributions fund that's open to contributions from other sources. And I also think Australia's strategy for nature is finally starting to get a little bit of more attention within government in terms of maybe prioritising and guiding how we restore landscapes and that sort of thing. So there's a whole lot of things coming out, some of them directly related to the EPBC, some of them peripherally related. But I think ultimately we just need to look at how we can use all that stuff in a really smart way and expect that we need to set a vision of the kind of future developments we want, the future urban landscape we want. And we can use all those tools to do it. So do we want high cost, unserviced, sprawling nature deserts, or do we want compact, better serviced and affordable, vibrant urban areas that have got green spaces and accessible to deep nature just outside the city? So that's my vision, and I think we just need to demand that of governments, developers and investors.
Absolutely. Mara, do you have any thoughts you want to share? What do we want to see in 5 years' time?
Well, I am super optimistic because yesterday, City of Gold Coast had this debate about putting a cableway into Gondwana rainforest, like the world's stupidest idea. We've been going at it for more than 20 years. But yesterday, they actually decided, you know what? If there's any proponents crazy enough to put that up, it's now up to them. And we have been socializing the cost and privatizing the benefit of all this nonsense in inappropriate areas that not only are hugely not resilient in terms of disasters, but just thoroughly inappropriate for biodiversity. The fact that Queensland has turned its ecotourism and nature-based branding lens into the Olympics now gives us, the community, an opportunity to reflect that in the experience of everyone that's going to see, live, and visit here. And I just think it's game changing. If we can work across all levels of politics, and we have to work with Pauline Hanson too, we just have to reach across and say, it is just so special that we have these magical things here in Queensland. And you know what? They are not dream world. They are the real world. And so they're worth so much more. And I actually think we can do it.
Yes, optimistic, absolutely. Michelle, you have any thoughts? 5 years hence, where are we going to be?
Yeah, thanks, Monica. 5 years. I guess I would love to see an enforced EPBC Act now that we do have these unacceptable impacts, which are supposedly trying to stop the loss of things that we can't replace, like those irreplaceable habitat features that Adam spoke about. Then that would be a great step forward compared to what we've seen for the last 25 years. But even if it doesn't happen, I would also then love to see industry and businesses make a nature positive pledge and just say, even if it is legal to clear this wonderful patch of habitat, I'm not going to do it. My social responsibility is to safeguard these places, make them better, even if I do need to clear some places, which is, part and parcel of infrastructure, I'm going to offset it. The things that I can offset, I will offset. The things that we can't, I'm just not going to touch. That would be my dream. Thanks.
Fantastic. Abby.
I would love the benefits that nature bring to the built environment to be actually genuinely recognised and appreciated and properly understood and just adopted widely. That would be my vision, where we can have, little critters running up and down buildings and jumping from buildings to, flying between buildings and running through our landscapes. Yeah, the connectivity, all of it.
Great. So we've got a few questions in the Q&A. So I guess this one is really looking at carrying capacity of bioregions and can it be used as a context for assessing measurements of net nature gain? Michelle, I reckon you being the scientist and the academic in the room might have a bit of a go at that.
I'm going to handball that one to Adam. My quick thoughts. My quick thoughts are that it's a good idea. It's not done in practice. Net gain is really, from an offsetting perspective, is really done on an offsets calculator where they say, right, we are going to clear X amount, so therefore you need to restore X amount. But often, and what the federal government are currently proposing is a pay to destroy kind of system where a developer can clear a block of land, pay into a fund, and then the government then takes that responsibility and the industry is absorbed from that responsibility. And that fund is then paid out to restore and do good things, apparently. Every single review of this type of scheme doesn't work, and yet the federal government are trying to put it into the new EPBC Act, which will be an absolute disaster. And yeah, most of the time people are clearing things that cannot be offset. And so that fund just stays unspent because they can't find a like for like to restore. But I'll hand over to Adam for a more eloquent answer.
Not at all more eloquent, and I think you've addressed the net gain part of the question really well. Look, I don't think that, in my view, carrying capacity is necessarily relevant to the net gain calculation, but I think it's very relevant to bioregional planning, and I think that's sort of part of the idea with bioregional planning. I certainly hope so, if it goes well, that it's looking across a large area and making decisions about, what is important to be retained for conservation, where does development need to go, and doing that consistently. And that's all about as much about carrying capacity, if you like, as it is about nature and economic drivers. So it's a really nice way of integrating all of those things together. We're still at early days in terms of how that's going to roll out, but that's my hope, that it will be able to address those things well.
So we've got another question from Caroline Pitcock. Wouldn't it be great if the people who want to remove vegetation need to demonstrate there's no impact, I guess, of ecosystems in order to gain the approval and put the responsibility, time and money on them? So, why does the system, I guess, always look after the interests of those rather than, I guess, the interests of people who want to preserve nature? It's more of a philosophical question, I guess. Any thoughts from anybody there?
I'm happy to start with that one, Monica, if you like.
Yep.
I think it's a great question. And I reckon some of the, look, I'm not a champion of the federal government necessarily, but I do think some of this is embedded in some of the EPBC reform processes that they're setting up. I do think the fact that they're trying to set up much clearer rules, and as I said earlier, there's still quite a bit of work to put the flesh on some of that, but they're trying to set up much clearer rules. And they've established a new National Environmental Protection Agency, which will be using those rules and, demonstrating, I guess, proper kind of compliance in all its forms. So that's about education, behaviour change, enforcement, making sure the rules are followed. And I think a lot of this is around front-loading the process. So in combination with all the new information and data that's starting to be better organised and made available through Environment Information Australia, I think there's going to be an increasing expectation that people will need to know what the rules are and use the data to put in their applications, and it will and the rules will require that impacts are properly addressed. We're not fooling ourselves in terms of this is going to stop all impacts. It's not about that. The EPBC is very clear that it's only about controlling significant impacts on matters of national environmental significance. I think that's a little unfortunate, but nonetheless, within that context, I think a lot of the reforms are going to put more of the onus on, because the system will be set up to support this, more of the onus on, applications being put in with all of that stuff up front.
Great. So we have another question here. So, I think this is really important as well to get our heads around. So if residential clearing has the most impact, shouldn't we try and reduce, it's all about population issues. Does that mean that we need to be looking at immigration numbers as well? I mean, there's a couple of ways we can tackle that. And, Mara, what are your reflections on that question?
It's a very challenging question, isn't it? Having come back from a country where we visited 8 cities that each had between 10 and 15 million people, perfectly planned with high rises, restored rivers, lakes, abundant nightlife. I mean, China plans. So for us, a country with 25 million people, like a poofteenth of the global challenge. And even so, the reason why we're trashing through koala habitat is not because of more immigrants, right? It's because of property developers and their ability to lobby. Let's call a spade a spade. The flip side of our wonderful democracy is it is fraught with corruption and lobbying intention. And I say that is actually the root cause. So I worry of a world with borders, where we pretend to solve global challenges like climate change, biodiversity, by locking down, as opposed to creating the right standards and the right approaches within our difficult, very, very different political models. But I think, Adam, the EPBC optimism is well-founded in theory. My best friend Claude, who has become, my little McKinsey, right, tells me that having evaluated the partnership between the Queensland government and the federal government, that really there were 3 regional plans: Gulf Plains, Brigalow Belt, and then Southeast Queensland. 2 of them were kind of released as a standalone plan, but not so much Southeast Queensland, because of housing supply imperatives, development lobby tension, koala habitat conflicts, and, design factors, call it that. So at some level, it's up to us, the community, broadly. That's residents, it's businesses, it's our local representatives, it's our elected, it's absolutely our research community that gives us the guardrails within which to work. That's how we're going to make a positive system happen, I think, as opposed to pretending that somehow if we just lock things out, she'll be right.
No, we have to be active in our own communities to make that happen. So there's a question here of, have we kind of worked with Aboriginal communities to better understand where the keystone species are located? And if we have, included that information, I guess, in the irreplaceable ecosystems work. And I'm going to give a look again to you, Michelle, and or Abby, to kind of help respond to that, please.
Yeah, so we didn't within this report, but it absolutely needs to happen. As Adam mentioned, the irreplaceable habitat features is a new trigger. It's a new term. So they are still grappling with how to define it, how to map it, how to describe these things. For some things, it's quite simple. If you have a greater glider and it has it dens in a old growth forest with its hollow bearing trees, that is irreplaceable. It takes 100 to 300 years to replace those features. And so obviously if you knock it out, the species is going to go extinct before it gets a chance to come back and use it. And so those examples are quite simple, but nature is complicated, and the keystone species and the cultural values that are irreplaceable as well just haven't really been explored yet to my knowledge. But it absolutely needs to happen, and it's on the onus of the government to lead that work, in my opinion.
Great. And Abby, do you have anything that you'd want to add?
I wouldn't. I think Michelle's answered that expertly, so I don't really have anything to add. But I would take one of the other questions on the list.
Yeah, well, let's move to that then. So, another question, anonymous attendee, don't know who you are, but let's call you Michelle. So, when it comes to nature positive commitments in construction of the built environment, how do companies reconcile the nature impacts of their supply chain, given the World Green Building Council indicate around 95% of the building and construction impacts are upstream? I think that's such an interesting area, and sort of really at the heart of what we in MECLA want to start leaning into more fully. And I think if we want to bring climate and nature together, then looking at the material impact of the supply chains is going to be fundamental. Mara, you talked about China is starting to look at this in a very serious way. So Abby, yeah, I'd love to hear you.
Yeah, so this is actually something that I've given a lot of. This is what keeps me up at night, really, because I know we talk very much the research, but really the research that we've been talking about is the footprint, isn't it? We did touch on resources in the research, but so you're absolutely right. So obviously we need to quantify them is the first step in really understanding what those supply chain impacts are, which I know MECLA's done some great work and a lot of partnerships towards that. But I guess it's then what? So for example, if a supply chain says that water is something that they're heavily dependent on and they're drawing a lot of it, what happens then? So I know from the Biodiversity Council research that you mentioned, Mara, a lot of the top ASX listed companies actually had water as their biggest dependency. And so I think one of the ways that we handle this is looking at landscape level restoration. So for example, if we have supply chain players who are drawing large amounts of water for their processing, then one of the things that we can do is actually use methods, and they're coming out of Europe, where we can recharge the catchments through the catchment management approaches and the way that we can do habitat restoration. And so you can actually take catchment approaches to recharge water back into those areas to sort of reduce those, I guess, make more availability for those supply chains. And the same with other supply chain members if they're having, high biodiversity impacts. And I know we talk a lot about offsetting, but in my mind, I think the solution is getting back to landscape conservation, restoration. How do we restore water? How do we restore soil quality and biodiversity? I think we've got to stop looking at our little patch, and we need to actually think a bit bigger in the landscape and partner. And maybe the industry needs to come together with, those supply chains, take responsibility for their proportion that they pay for that product, and just get on with it and go back to basic principles of restoring our landscapes.
Fantastic. Anybody else have any other reflections on that particular question?
Well, the insight from doing the report with the Biodiversity Council and then reflecting on this one comes back to value chains and how we think about value chains. And it really reflects on that immigration and, kind of narrowness. It's a broad issue. So my neighbor literally across the driveway is the operations lead for Hutchie's, biggest property developer here on the coast. He's in China every other week. And I'm like, Paul, mate, when you go back, I want to find out, when you get those massive windows for the 3 big high rises, what is that company doing? Because biodiversity is a global issue, right? And so I think the more we broaden our lens, and yes, we do have to measure these things, but what the Biodiversity Council report revealed is plenty of data out there. I don't care if some of it's modeled for scope 3, plenty of data does not stop us from acting. And I love Abby's idea. Where we can act is at that landscape, bioregional ecosystem level, and bring all actors in, community, government, business. Together, we can really bring this back. As you can see, if I took this picture today, it would be thriving, absolutely full of forest.
Absolutely right. So we are in the final 5 minutes. So I'm going to whip around all of you, and great that you could join us as well, Sophie. Just the final reflections before we close out. I will turn to you, Sophie. I can't see you online at the moment. Michelle, I'm going to start with you. Final reflections on our conversation today, please.
Oh, thanks, Monica. Yeah, and thanks so much for having me. My final reflections would be that there is a lot of hope and there's still a lot left in Australia to protect and restore. We haven't lost everything. We're not quite like China where we've got it all sorted, but there's a lot left in Australia that we love, and we just need the ambition and the political will and will from our industry partners. But yeah, no, thank you so much.
Great. And Sophie?
Thank you. I'm going to say we just need to act too. I think the point's been made. Mara just said we have all the data and information we need. And I think that was something we really tried to drive in this report, was to give you some key actions that we can all do together, to Abby's point, but also that when no matter where you are in the value chain, whether you're in government, whether you're in industry, whether you're in advocacy, that there's some very clear action. So I'd love to see action out of this. Thank you.
Great. Adam?
I would probably just say in conclusion that, the EPBC reforms may help. It's certainly a lot better than the previous version of the legislation, but the question is how well it goes through implementation. There's a lot more work to be done, and we really need to hold government to account on their promise to strengthen nature protections. But outside the EPBC Act, there's so much that everyone can do, and there's a lot of great, things happening, tools and data coming out as a result of the EPBC reforms that we can use in other ways outside the actual regulatory environment.
Fantastic. Thank you. Abby?
Oh, wow. So we've talked about so much. We've covered so much ground today. I think I'd probably, just reflecting on it, people may not know, but this report started with a chat where three of us came together, Monica, myself, and Sophie, and said, we're not sure about this thing. We don't know the answer to our industry's contribution to vegetation clearance because the data wasn't there. It was always combined in with agricultural, other land uses. So we just decided to, well, why don't we, I know this great researcher called Michelle, why don't we ask her? And we just kind of kept building, and we just followed it, and it was just driven by that. We wanted to know the answer because we wanted the industry, and we ourselves wanted to take responsibility for the impacts that our industry creates. And so we followed that cookie trail. And then, it wasn't just about identifying the problem, it was about what the steps were. So I think for us, that's been a journey. It's been a year in the making. I think we've been talking, or maybe even a little bit more, I think maybe even more like 18 months this has taken us. So I think that would be my reflection, is to come together. The solutions need us all to come together. So I think it's great we got this far.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, everybody. I think we will follow up with an email. You can find it on the MECLA website, mecla.org.au. And also you can find it on the WWF website under resources. And it really has been a labour of love, this report. And I really thank Michelle, Sophie, Abby, and of course Adam and Mara for being contributors to our conversation today, and the many other people who have gone into helping get this report to where it is today. And you can hear that there's a very strong will, opportunity to engage in us sort of creating a more nature positive and regenerative conversation, not just for Australia and country for Australia, but also to be able to take some of these learnings to the world, and vice versa. What is happening in the rest of the world in this biodiversity positive space that we can bring to learn into the MECLA community and broader to Australia. So thank you very much, and we'll be in touch. Bye for now.
Thank you.